As we have our Bibles open to Genesis chapter 50, verse 15, let's read there. This is after they just got done burying their father, all right? There's years have been passed, but this is right after they just got done burying their father, Jacob. They come back, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for the evil that we did to him." Now, picture that. The whole time, Joseph's brothers are the ones that sold him into slavery, almost killed him, but ended up selling him into slavery and betrayed him. Joseph already told him when he revealed himself to him once, he said, "I am Joseph." They were all scared. He said, "Don't worry, you guys meant it for evil, but God used it for good. I forgive you." It looked like they believed him that Joseph forgave him. Until we get to this text. Now, Daddy's not around anymore. Even though everybody in this text is grown adults, there was the whole patriarch going on here where the father was still in charge of all of the families. Very much not how it is today, but that's what it was in this text. So it wasn't until after they went off and buried their dad, then they came back. So when it says, when they saw their father was dead, I mean, you could picture their eyes looking at each other like as big as quarters. Joseph couldn't do anything to us before because he knew it would upset Dad. Dad wouldn't like it, but guess what? Dad's not here anymore. What's he going to do? It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for the evil that we did to him. Verse 16. This is cringeworthy. There are so many cringeworthy things in this passage. So they sent a message to Joseph. Oh, already. Why don't you just talk to the guy? They hide behind a messenger. They don't have the guts to even talk to him. They sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of God of your father." And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. They's referring to the messengers. This was all through messengers. Joseph has been through a lot in his life. His mom died giving birth to one of his younger brothers. His dad loved him, but caused him a lot of dissension with the rest of his family because he was the favorite. The rest of his brothers hated him, wanted to kill him, captured him, threw him in a pit, sold him into slavery. He built a relationship with his master Potiphar, yes, but then before you know it, his wife betrayed him, falsely accused him. Potiphar said, "You're going to jail." Joseph's had a rough life, very rough life. He has these two cellmates, the butler and the baker. He interprets their dreams. One of them gets out and says, "Get me out of here." When you get out of here, forgets about him. There's one sense that Joseph is longing for. It's a sense of family. Joseph has never had that before. He's never had a sense of family, ever. And now he already told him, "I forgive you guys, I forgive you guys." And now he has this messenger come to him. And the messenger says, "Your brother sent me. Your father gave this command before he died." Now, is that controversial or what? I'm a Christian, I'm a Baptist, I don't gamble. But I'd bet $100 that he didn't say that. Okay. It's very sketchy, to say the least. Your father gave this commandment before he died. Say to Joseph. So the brothers are cowards right now. They refuse to talk to Joseph in person. They hide behind a messenger. They're putting words in their dead father's mouth. And they're doing something else. Now forgive the transgression of the servants of God. They're playing the spiritual card as well. They're complete cowards in this passage. They're hiding behind four different things. And at this point, Joseph realizes, I thought I told you guys that I forgave you. I thought we had this relationship, and it just crushes Joseph. He's never had a sense of family before. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Apparently, during his weeping, look what happens in verse 18. His brothers also came in and fell down before him. So his brothers could have been listening at the door. That's not a new trick, right? It's very likely, it doesn't say for sure, but it's immediately after that, his brothers also came in and fell down before him. Behold, we be your servants. Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. And thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. That's the first scene here is really, once again, this closing from verse 15 through 26 of Genesis. That's the end of the one conflict right there was already solved, and that is this final resolution between Joseph and his brothers. He's not really saying anything he didn't already say to them. But now he finally convinces them to believe it. You see, his brothers did not really believe in the genuine power of forgiveness. They didn't. But Joseph did. So after their father dies, Joseph's brothers show their distrust of Joseph by trying to manipulate him. They tried to manipulate him. They hid behind 4 different things. But yet Joseph's life was marked by forgiveness. Everywhere he went, he was done wrong. And yet, everywhere he went, you do not see cords or seeds of bitterness anywhere. If there's one thing that Joseph learned, it was how to forgive. And Joseph could forgive because he trusted God. Look at verse 20. As for you, you meant it evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that everyone's going to be kept alive. You see, when their dad died, there was the leadership change in their family. Their dad, the patriarch, could no longer be there for him. Now they all realized, we're in Goshen. Guess what? Guess who's second in command here? We're on Joseph's turf. And they had to grasp the concept and receive forgiveness. Now, how do you know Joseph really forgave them? It was not a family obligation. He comforted them and spoke kindly to them. That's a mark of forgiveness, when you speak kindly to somebody that has done you wrong. Doesn't mean your relationship won't be the same. But it means you forgive them, you speak kindly to them. What does this all mean? What does this whole passage mean again? It means that God can use bad events to bring about good results in your life. Whatever you see as bad, we need to be careful what we label as bad, and even what we label as evil, because God can use evil to bring about good. He can use evil to bring about good. He can use evil to contribute to good. Now, catch this. God's not the author of evil. He's not the originator of evil. But when evil is done, God can use it to accomplish a greater good. It was evil. All of these things that happened to Joseph was evil. This is not right. But God used it to accomplish something good. You see, if you ever made anything in the kitchen, you know exactly what it's talking about here. Have you ever went into the kitchen and been hungry? Boy, I'm hungry. What do we got? You go into the kitchen, you don't find anything, then you go in the pantry where the good stuff is. You see this bag of white powder flour. Oh, I love flour. You get your spoon and you just start eating, right? Anybody ever done that? Any good? No. What if you accidentally grab the baking powder next to it and you just start eating it? Not very good. Anybody ever been like Rocky and cracked a couple eggs and drank them before, right? Not very good. I know. Now I know some people here have been brave enough to have a tablespoon of just raw pure vanilla extract, right? Butter? Anybody ever eaten a stick of butter? 2 sticks of butter? Oh, we got one. All right, Joe. Yeah. Heavy cream. What do you like to drink? Oh, heavy cream, please. They're gross alone. But you put them together, how does a nice vanilla cake sound? You see that? God can take things that don't taste good individually and put them all together, and just like you put a cake in the oven, God has this thing called time that he uses. And he can use evil things and things that don't taste good, wicked things, to make something good. I heard a preacher say it like this week, that sodium is poisonous for you. Chlorine is poisonous. In fact, in World War I, one of the poison gases was chlorine gas. They would breathe in chlorine, their lungs would fill up with blisters, they would pop, and they would drown from the inside. Not good for you. Mix them together and you get salt. Now, one of my favorite things about McDonald's fries is putting extra salt on it, and then when I'm done with the fries, the favorite part is not the fries, it's licking the salt off my lips. Love it. But those two things are poisonous. But you put them together and what? You get something good. Right? God can use evil events. He can use you being stabbed in the back and double-crossed to bring about good. Because Joseph's eyes were not on his brothers, Joseph's eyes was on God and the good that God made out of it. And now catch this, it's easier for Joseph in this passage because he got to see the good to happen. He got to see his brothers come to visit Egypt, his whole family migrate to Egypt, 70 people in total, and be saved from the famine. But catch this, you and I today have to deal with a lot of wickedness, and we may not see the goodness that God brings from it. But just because we don't see it doesn't mean God doesn't use it. It'll take faith. But God can use evil to contribute to good. That's what he's saying here. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive. And because Joseph's eyes were on God, he could really, genuinely forgive his brothers for the pure wickedness that they did to him. All throughout his life, he's always had a tug back to family. He's always had a soft spot for family. Another time he wept is when the brothers brought their youngest brother, Benjamin, there, and he actually saw Judah and the other brothers' response to Benjamin, that they actually genuinely loved him, and he couldn't control himself, and he wept. And that's when he revealed himself. Joseph had to deal with a lot of evil, but he had to master the art of forgiveness. Have you mastered it yet? You will need to. The good thing is we have the best teacher of forgiveness. It's Jesus. Jesus paid everything so he can forgive us. And so we will forgive others. So Joseph had a rough life starting out. The first about 30 years of his life, 40 years of his life, was marked by betrayal, by forgiveness that he had to extend. But the end of his life, after I say end, it was a long time he spent in Egypt, he went through this terrible toil as what you see represented in verses 15 through 19. His relationship with his brothers, that is so symbolic of the beginning of his life. And then you see, verse 22, the second part of his life here. It says, so Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. Of all of the great things that Joseph did, Joseph also appears in Hebrews chapter 11, which is where, there's a lot of things about Hebrews. Did Paul write it? A lot of people believe it was Luke. Could have been either. What was Hebrews? It's not really an epistle. It's not a letter like Paul's. Many believe it has the form of a sermon, and it's very, very, very likely that the book of Hebrews is actually a sermon. In fact, I know a preacher that memorized the book of Hebrews and just preached it one day as a church. I shouldn't have said that, but in that, Hebrews chapter 11 gives examples of Old Testament prophets that have lived their life out. and he gives some words of commendation. He commends them for some things. Now, if you were to commend Joseph for anything, what would you commend him for? If it was you writing the book of Hebrews, if you were preaching or teaching a lesson on your own, on the book of Hebrews, and you had to fill in the blank, by faith, Joseph, what would you put there? It'd be tempting to say, by faith, he forgave his brothers, right? It's a great thing. How about this? By faith, Joseph interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh. What would happen if he would have interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh and he would have got it wrong? See, just that interpretation of a dream when he did that to Pharaoh, that took faith. Tremendous amount of faith. By faith, Joseph became second in command of all of Egypt. By faith, Joseph saved his family and migrated them to Egypt to survive the famine. But yet in Hebrews 11:22, here's what it says. It's quite surprising. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Huh? Really? Oh, whoever preached this sermon in Hebrews, you don't know how to preach. Let me give you some better stuff. That's what he's commended for? Of everything that Joseph did. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. That's what we have here in the last few verses of chapter 50, of the very last few verses of Genesis. Let's look. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. And the children of Machir and the son of Manasseh were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die. This is what he says. This is Joseph's will. This is his final arrangements here. But God will visit you and bring you up out of the land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made his sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him. The last words of the book of Genesis. He was put in a coffin in Egypt. Book of Genesis starts with a beautiful, in the beginning, God created the heavens of the earth. It starts with a beautiful, unchanging, all-knowing, holy, perfect, righteous, we could go on and on, God, who's the main character throughout it. Starts with him creating this perfect Garden of Eden that man messes up, and it ends with Joseph was put in a coffin in Egypt. What's so commendable about being put in a coffin in Egypt? What's so commendable about Joseph saying, swear to me, God's going to come, and when he comes, he's going to lead you out of here, and I want you to put me in a coffin and take my bones up with you out of here. What's so special about that? Why does that merit, that action of his life? Why would the writer of Hebrews consider that to be the greatest act of faith in his life? That's a valid question. It's special because Joseph knew that God's plan was bigger than his life. Think about it. First half, this passage here, 15 through the end of the chapter, gives us a glimpse at the first half of his life, marked by tragedy, marked by evil, on the receiving end of evil, and marked by forgiveness. The second half of his life, as portrayed by the scriptures, is he's second in command of all of Egypt. He's the wealthiest person in the land. He's literally king. He's second to Pharaoh. In fact, in Genesis 41, after he interprets the dream of Pharaoh, this is what Pharaoh did to him. In Genesis 41, verses 40 to 45, Joseph came out of prison. This is what Pharaoh did. He set him over his own house. He said, Joseph, you're going to be over my own house. Then he set him over all of Egypt. Then the Pharaoh took his signet ring off of his hand and put it on Joseph. What's so special about that? See, nowadays we do writing with the ink. Give me your signature. Back then it was the signet ring. If the king or Pharaoh wanted to put their authority on something, they would say, boom, in a wax. And that would have the symbol and the crest. That was the authority over the entire kingdom of Egypt. He says, hey, I'm giving this to you. He gave him authority over all of Egypt. Equal authority to the Pharaoh himself. He gave him his own authority. He clothed Joseph in garments of fine linen. He put a gold chain around his neck. He made Joseph ride in his second chariot. Everywhere the Pharaoh went, Joseph was in second one, right behind Pharaoh. And as he rode, he made other people bow the knee before Joseph. He gave Joseph an Egyptian name and an Egyptian wife. What's special about him being put in a coffin? Well, if you know anything about ancient Egypt, you know they have elaborate coffins, but usually the coffins are put somewhere. See, what's missing here is he's never buried. He's never placed in a tomb. Never. He's put in a coffin in Egypt. What's special about that? Egypt is known for their elaborate tombs. Egypt is known for their pyramids. They would work on these tombs and they would be gold all over, and they would have the most elaborate burials. Joseph said, I don't want any of that. I want you to put my bones in a coffin, and listen here, I brought you guys here. God used me to save the world from the famine, right? He used me, I brought you guys here to escape the famine, but one day, God is going to call you out of Egypt and back to the promised land. So I'm not going to have, even though he has the full authority, imagine the tomb he could have had. Imagine the wealth and the riches and the honor he could have been buried with. But he willingly chose to put my body in a coffin, and when God gets you out of here back to the promised land, take me up and bury me in the family grave. What a request. What a request. That is a statement. Even though God did great things in his life, he knew his life would pass, and he knew God has a future that must be embraced. So what does this mean for us? Joseph hit a home run for that. But what does this mean for us in 2023 in Marion, Ohio? Joseph lived 110 years. That's definitely longer than the average lifespan today. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's possible for somebody in this room to outlive Joseph, but it's highly unlikely. If Joseph realized that as significant of a person he was in history, in national history, in spiritual history, and everything, and he realized, yeah, everything I did, my whole legacy in Egypt, everything that I have, I don't care about it. I want to be far away from it, actually. I don't belong here. I belong back in Canaan. And there's that family grave where we just buried my dad in. I belong there. I want you to put my bones in a coffin. Don't entomb me. Don't bury me. And when you guys get out of here, whether it's in your life or the generation, in fact, it ended up being over 400 years. Joseph's bones laid in the coffin. If Joseph lived 110 years and was that significant to be considered a major character in the book of Genesis, yet he realized his place in God's plan was small. So small, in fact, he was willing to have nothing to do with it in his death. Yeah, forsake it all. Forsake it all. I don't want that Egyptian burial. I don't want to be known as a co-pharaoh. I don't want any of that. Put me in a coffin, take me back there. If somebody so big, that's in Hebrews 11, realized that his life, his legacy, if you will, his ministry was tiny compared to what God was really doing, how much more should you and I realize that today? See, what does this mean? It means because your time in God's plan is short, you should embrace the timeless plan of God. What does that mean? It means you and I have a small place in God's plan, that so small, in fact, we should not hang on to anything too much. If one person had something to hang on to in the book of Genesis, it's Joseph. He had a lot to hang on to. But he said, no, I don't want any of it. I don't want any of it. You see, mature faith knows the glory days are not in the past, they're in the future. Because God's plan continues after your death, you can know today that the best days, however you define the glory days, it is not in the past, nor is it in the present. If you are a believer, a follower of Christ, if you've put your faith in Jesus Christ, the glory days are in the future. We all know this, really. We sing hymns like Beulah Land, right? Good one. When we all get to heaven, another good one. In the sweet by and by, one of my personal favorites, Rock of Ages. Been singing that all morning. And the more you long for heaven, the less you will be attached to the things of the world. Think of what Joseph could have held on to. He could have taken the whole work of his life in Egypt. Man, I have a unique legacy in my family. The rest of you have that thing up in Canaan. Yeah, what do you have, some little cave? You have a little lot that all you have is a grave there? Pfft. I gave you Goshen. Yeah, that was just my spare change. I have everything here. He had to realize, he realized everything he worked for his entire life, he no longer needed. He was willing to put all the suffering he's went through, all the evil he has endured, to become second in command of all of Egypt. It's nothing compared to what God has in store. Put me in a coffin. Get me out of here when you guys get out of here. The glory days are always in the future. Always. He knew that the best God offers was not going to be realized in his life. It's not going to be realized in his life. Joseph had hope beyond the grave. Joseph did not embrace an unhealthy attachment to what he was familiar with. Oh, God used Joseph in a mighty way, but at the end of his life, Joseph said, leave it all. Leave it all. I don't belong here. This is just Egypt. Put my bones in a coffin, and when you get out of here, take me with you. He was not trying to hang on to the past. He was anticipating the future. Think of the elaborate burial Joseph could have had. He could have been, we said that King Tut is the short name. I don't even want to try to pronounce his full one. I just say it different every time, right? He was known as the Child King, and it was one of the Egyptian pharaohs he was one of the youngest, and he had one of the most elaborate burials. Think of how much more Joseph's could have been. And yet, all throughout their lives, today in this world, both unbelievers and believers, non-Christians and Christians, it's part of being human. We struggle with wanting to hang on to things. You ever watch the TV show Hoarders? Some people hoard in their grave. They do. In fact, the Hollywood icon and father of Jamie Lee Curtis, his name was Tony Curtis, Jamie Lee Curtis's father, died in 2010. You want to know what he was buried with? I got to read it because it's a long list. Curtis shared his coffin with a traveling bag full of photos, and letters, a model of his car, driving gloves, apparently he thought he was going to drive it, some cash, his Navy medals, a pair of his grandson's baby shoes, a patch from the country of Hungary, gold coins, 2 watches, stones he'd picked up on his travels in various places, DVD clips of his favorite films, his iPhone, sunglasses, 7 packets of Splenda. No joke. I'll give you the source. A sleep mask, his dog's ashes, paintbrushes, paints, sketch pads, and a pen. And he was buried wearing his signature outfit, white shorts, his favorite white sweater, an Armani scarf, and his well-worn Stetson under his arm. The idea was that his coffin and his burial would tell the story of his life. In a similar way, that's exactly what Joseph did with his coffin. Story of my life is not the glory here on earth. Catch this. God, this is where it makes it so difficult here. This is a heavy passage because it's easy for us to read into this flesh stuff, sinful stuff, like we want to consume, we're Americans, it's a consumer culture here, and selfish stuff. But Joseph did not ask to be put in second in command of all of Egypt. In fact, God gave him that, and that was his ministry. And even God's working in his life, his ministry for all his life that he worked for, what he paid for when he suffered, and it was evil and evil and evil, and God did this in his life. He said, I don't need it anymore. I'm not going to be buried with all that stuff. God's plan is bigger than my life. And the glory days are not in the past. They're in the future. He is the first one to mention an exodus. What is an exodus? It's like the exit. You leave, you go out. In fact, look what happens. Turn the page to the book of Exodus, hence the name, right? Verse 8 of chapter 1. We're not starting Exodus. I just want to talk about it real quick. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to all of his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they'll join their enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. What does that mean? Exodus chapter 1 talks about how all of these Hebrews were in Egypt. And the next Pharaoh said, Joseph, yeah, who's that? I don't care. I'm the Pharaoh now. I'm the one in charge now. And these people are a threat to us. In fact, let's enslave them. Set taskmasters over them. And it was 400 years. Israel, the nation. The people that Joseph brought to Egypt multiplied and multiplied. He brought 70 people. Yet 400 years later, Moses leads them out of the Exodus, out of Egypt, right? He leads 1 to 3 million out. You see, this lesson that Joseph had about this God working through evil, let me ask you this. Was it evil that they were enslaved? Of course it was. But what did God promise Abraham in Genesis chapter 12? Land, seed, that's people. Did God work during the time they were enslaved for 400 years? Oh yeah, they went from a nation of 70 to a nation of millions. You see that? And yet, during that 400 years, Joseph's coffin was around there somewhere. It wasn't buried. It wasn't entombed. In fact, everybody knew about it. We know because in Exodus chapter 13, Exodus chapter 13, verse 19 says this, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will visit you. You shall carry up my bones with you from here. And then we read over in Joshua, that's when he leaves. And then we read over in Joshua 24, verse 32, as for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem in the piece of the land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. It became an inheritance upon the descendants of Joseph. At some point, over 400 years later, his bones were brought up out of Egypt. They found that same cave. They saw the other bones in there. They pushed them to the side, laid Joseph's bones in with his family. All the glory of Egypt, all of his past ministry, everything God did in his life, Joseph didn't ask for it. God did it in his life. He was willing to not idolize, because he knew God had greater things in the future. He was eventually buried in the family grave. For 400 years, that coffin was not buried. It was not entombed. The last words, he was put in a coffin in Egypt. What happened to the coffin? It was around there somewhere. People knew about it because when Pharaoh finally said to Moses, fine, get everybody out of here. Okay, they gathered all their stuff and they knew to grab the coffin of Joseph's bones. What did that coffin mean to them for that 400 years? Their whole life, they were enslaved. For that 400 years after him, the whole nation of Israel was enslaved. I know we're enslaved here. I know this isn't a fun time, but son, let me tell you, there's a coffin, and there's a coffin of somebody who was in our family who used to be second in command of this land, and God told him, one day we're going to be out of here, and one of these days we're going to go out of here and we're going to take that coffin. Let me take you to go see that coffin. And that coffin gave them hope of the deliverance that God would bring to them one day. You see, Joseph's bones being put in the coffin in Egypt was for him, but God did not just use it for him. He used it to give the generations after him the hope that the glory days are in the future and that God's plan will long outlast us. Long outlast us. So what would you put in your coffin today? What would you put in your coffin? What are you not willing to say goodbye to? Do you believe the best days are in the past? Or do you believe the best days are in the future? God's plan went forward. It went forward. 2 to 3 million people came out of Egypt, and that coffin was a testimony to them that they had hope God would deliver them. So that's good for the people in Egypt that were those 2 to 3 million that lived during those 400 years. They had a coffin they could look to. Jesus didn't leave us any bones. He didn't leave us a coffin. What do we have today? Jesus left us an empty grave today, saying, if I go, I'm going to return again. We have something that that reminds us today of the future deliverance that God will bring to anybody who accepts Christ as their Savior, anybody who has faith in Jesus. And it's not a pile of bones in a grave. It's an empty grave in Israel. That's what he was saying. John 14, Jesus was talking to Thomas. He was saying, my Father's house has many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me. In other words, there's going to be another Exodus. There's going to be another Exodus. That where I am, you may be also. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. It's good to be in church this morning, but there is not one person sitting in a church anywhere who has ever sat in a church that went to heaven because they sat in church. Jesus said, I am the way. Jesus himself is the way. You can't get to heaven just by sitting in church. You can go to Israel today. Many here have been there and have saw the grave that many believe was the tomb that many believe is Christ's, likely. And it's empty. And that should give us hope. But even just going there and seeing that empty grave is not going to take anybody to heaven today. It's a personal faith inside of you. Do you genuinely believe that Jesus Christ died for your sins and that he has the power to forgive sins, that he rose again, and that he's coming again? Have you confessed your sin to him? Do you know for a fact that you have the same hope that all of Israel had for 400 years? Yes, they were enslaved in Egypt, but 400 years they had a coffin they could look at, say, there's hope that we're out of here. Does the empty grave of Jesus Christ mean anything to you today? If it doesn't, I'd love to meet with you one-on-one and open up the Bible and answer your questions if I can, and just spend some time with you and get you to a place where you can trust Christ as your Savior. If you are a believer here, what would you put in your coffin? Are you willing to believe that the best days are yet to come? That's what being a Christian is all about. That's what being a believer is all about. It's not the best days are in the past. The best days are in the future.